Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Am I live there, Dave? Welcome
Yes.
to our second lifelong learning Zoom presentation. My name is Frank McIntyre, and I'm sitting in on and speaking on behalf of Chris Duncan Webb, who is our chairperson for our lifelong learning committee. It's too bad we have to have these presentations on Zoom and miss our face-to-face socializing and cookies and tea. But I'm sure some of you are pretty happy you didn't have to go out and face that weather out there today. We're going to be recording this session and we'll be posting it on our website for a period of 30 days. So if you know someone who missed the presentation or if you just want to watch it again, you can find it there. It'll be under canmoreseniors.org website. You click on activities and then lifelong learning, and the YouTube video will be listed there, as well as some of our future presentations. Because of all the feedback and with 50 people, we don't want everybody talking over each other. So what we're going to do for questions is we're going to get you to use the chat function on your Zoom. And when you do that, you'll type in a question and either send it to all or send it to myself, Frank McIntyre. We'll do our best to get through the presentation, and I'll try to summarize the questions as best I can. We do have to turn it off in an hour, so hopefully we can get through it all. I'm going to now turn it over to LeSueur, who is the sponsor for today's speaker, and he will introduce our speaker for today. Lee?
Thanks, Frank. Gee, it's great to see so many people. I mean, this is maybe outnumbering our live presentation, so Zoom is a success. But it's a pleasure for me, indeed, to introduce our speaker today, Richard LeSueur. His topic, the plane of waiting, viewing the present through an ancient lens. Reverend Dr. Richard LeSueur, after years of ministry in southern Alberta, was invited to serve as director of the desert program at St. George's College in Jerusalem. His work there was principally in the deserts of the Sinai, the Judean desert, and the eastern deserts of Egypt. This is the experience that underscores today's talk. Richard is now a resident of Canmore, a fellow Canmore senior, and he's pleased to bring some of this story of the desert and the community in Israel to our community at the edge of another wilderness. Richard?
Thank you, Lee. Thank you so much for a generous introduction. Let me just check if I speak like this, the sound is right and good?
Good.
Yep. All right, well, that's great. Interesting, Dave, that you began with some of the Gordy Lightfoot music and you played the great song, the singing of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And interestingly enough, that just brought back a huge memory because I was sailing with the Merchant Marine in 1975 on a lake ship. And my last time across Superior in October from Thunder Bay to Sault Ste. Marie, we were thrown around like a cork in a bathtub. And I went to the captain when we got back to our port, which was in Sarnia. And I just said, I can't go on any longer. And not that ship sank, but it certainly reminds us that Canada is a ferocious place. And the wilderness is a place of great risk, even as we experience the cold today. We're being kept inside, not just because of COVID, but because it's so cold outside. So welcome, everyone. Good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to be part of lifelong learning. And on this very frigid day, I want to take us to a place that's a lot warmer. I want to take us to the base of a mountain that's in the south central Sinai. And I want to tell us a few things about that landscape. And then we can use that as a framework for doing some reflecting on the landscape that we are walking at this time. Now, we've got to do a little practical, technical thing now because I've got some images that I want to show you. So this is where we switch into sharing the screen. So we'll just do that and see if that's coming up correctly for you now. Dave, we got a thumbs up on that. We're okay? Good. So let's just first locate the Sinai Peninsula. As a little geography first as we think of it. So this is the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And if we start at the top left-hand corner, we've got Greece and a yellow arrow that will take us across the Aegean and into the rugged mountainous area of Turkey and then into eastern Turkey, where we cross into Iran. And then as we swing back westwards, we cross into the plains and the Euphrates and Tigris rivers and really the breadbasket of civilization, as it's called, and present day Iraq. And then continuing on westwards across into Syria, out into the Mediterranean over the sliver of Lebanon, and then back across the sliver that is Israel, across the Jordan River at the point of the arrow into Jordan, and then down into Saudi Arabia, and then again going westwards across the Red Sea and the Nile River, Egypt, and then out across North Africa, Libya, etc. And then right in the center of it is the triangle of the Sinai Peninsula. And you know, it almost acts, when you look at it in this kind of way, as a hinge that ties together or holds together the great continents of Africa on the lower left-hand side, and Asia, and then Europe in the upper part of the frame, really linking and tying together this intersection of the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Just a little footnote here. I like this map, particularly because of the pink lines that are very faint, showing the political borders. And it reminds you that these are actually very recently added to this landscape, added at the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Turkish Empire was carved up by the victors of the First World War and the League of Nations, being the British, the French, and the Russians. And actually, still to this day, there is a stone block building on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, where at that time, Winston Churchill, who was then the foreign secretary, sat down with the others, and they rolled out the maps of the Middle East and drew the lines. So when something like the Arab Spring occurs 10 years ago at the end of 2010, 2011, and so on, I mean, you understand that you know, these are young nationalisms. At any rate, that's really a topic for another time. I'm way off here, but I just find it fascinating. So as we zoom in on this image and look at the Sinai Peninsula, that triangle, and this choice of a relief map was to illustrate and help us notice how the South Central Sinai is a mountainous region. And then north of that is this vast plain, this open plain that's actually called Ati. And Ati in Arabic simply means lost. So if you're out there, you're probably lost. It's not an environment you can easily move through. I mean, there are few roads, yes, but very, very few. I mean, it's mostly finding your way. And then the upper part of the Sinai Peninsula being the coastal region, where the sort of super highway of the ancient world ran, what the Romans called the Via Maris, the Via Road, Maris, sea, the road by the sea that linked together really the empires of the ancient world. And again, you know, one is tempted to sort of go off on a little tangent there. We're not going to do that. But this is the image from space of the Sinai. And of course, one of the things you notice right away in the upper left-hand corner is the Nile Delta, just that magnificent, enormous, fertile area fed by the waters flowing down from Upper Africa, down the Nile, with alluvial soils held in suspension, building out the delta before the waters fall into the Mediterranean Sea. But the sort of breadbasket of the ancient world, and even today still, of course. And then as you look at the triangle of the Sinai Peninsula, it's bounded on two sides by these fingers of water. On the left side is the Gulf of Suez, and at the uppermost tip of it is where the Suez Canal then linked together the lakes and other bodies of water for international shipping to go through to the Mediterranean Sea or down to the Red Sea, whichever direction. And then on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula is the Gulf of Aqaba. And at the uppermost point of that finger is the city, the port city of Aqaba for Jordan. And right next to it is the port city of Eilat of Israel. And then at the very point, the bottom point of the Sinai Peninsula, you'll notice there's some light bluish color, and that is the fantastic coral reefs that exist there with some of the most wonderful scuba diving in the world. In fact, last week, I was with Dr. Paul Lubitz, one of our skin specialists in town here in Canmore. And he was saying that at Sharm el Sheikh, that's the name of the place there, he has done a great deal of scuba diving there, and that's a little aside. So anyway, many features. But what we're going to focus on is the south central area of the Sinai Peninsula, which is this rugged, high, mountainous area. And I can hear a question in my mind that's probably going through your mind at this moment that I need to respond to, which is how large an area is this? If you put the point of the Sinai Peninsula in Fort McLeod, and you put the uppermost point of the coastline right by the delta at Hinton, and the other side in Edmonton, that's about the scale of it. It's almost 400 kilometers long, maybe 200 or so kilometers wide at its widest point before you come to the border between Egypt and Israel. So that's an approximate distance, but travel through it takes a great deal of time because you're really on dirt roads most of the way. So our interest is that mountainous area in the south central area. And this image, this picture from the edge of that area where the rock is sort of discolored, and geologists would love this, but quite a different sort of geology. And it illustrates the difference between desert and wilderness. That a desert we think of as sand and sand dunes and maybe rock appearing periodically, but the wilderness is just broken rock. It's desolation. It's windswept and forlorn. It's a kind of landscape of Genesis, you could say. It has a haunting magnificence. One of the great human narratives of Western civilization is a story that comes from this lonely and forlorn landscape of a people who found themselves in this wilderness. And within a very short time, were quite sure that they're going to die and not make it out. And the story comes from a period of approximately 3,000 years ago, approximately 1,250 years BCE, before the Common Era, where an ethnic minority that was living in the Delta lands in Egypt for about 500 years and had grown to a sizable minority were pressed into service along with other minority groups and ethnic minorities who were also living in the same Delta region. And they were pressed into service to help build the great cities of Pithom and Ramses. And it's believed that this occurred during the reign of the pharaoh Ramses II. And then through a sequence of compounding challenges, the presence of this particular ethnic group, who only in one instance in cuneiform writing from the time is named Habiru, became viewed by the governing authority as so harmful that they were literally sent away out of the land, released from their servitude, And their movement out into the Sinai wilderness from the Delta with haste happened under the leadership of one of their own whose name was Moses. And now you know I'm speaking about the story of the Exodus, the account of the Exodus that appears in the Hebrew scriptures, but we are not in one of Cecil B. DeMille's movies with 1,000 different characters, all right? I'm not going to roll out the whole story. I want to take us to one particular moment. And by the way, the name Moses actually means to be drawn out. Because as the story goes, he was drawn out as an infant from the Nile River, drawn out to a different future. And that, any one of us could look at moments in our own lives and say, there was a time when I was going in a certain direction, and something drew me out into another reality, another vocation, another thing that I needed to do that was part of my life. And in that sense, at those moments, our name becomes Moses. So in the moment of the story that I want to take us to is when they arrive, this group, this ethnic reality, this people of Israel arrive at a certain mountain in the south central Sinai. And that mountain was already known by Moses. He had been there before, and it had become a very significant mountain, a place of rendezvous, we could say. And you would know this yourselves as we hike in these mountains or we go out into the backcountry, that there are places that we can come to which become significant for us, that a place can take on a certain dimension where we've sat on a ledge or under a tree or sat by a river or sat by a lake. And it becomes a place where the reflective nature of life, we have been addressed in a way that speaks to our lives or our own feelings and so on, and becomes a significant place to which we may return again and again in our lives. Well, that's what this mountain had become for Moses. This is Sinai from a distance. We call it Mount Sinai. The Bedouin call it Jebel Musa. Jebel means mountain. Musa, Moses. It's Moses' mountain. And again, in this picture, we see the desolation of that wilderness. Let's move up towards that mountain now and up onto its slopes, about halfway up. Beneath the towering umber faces of Mount Sinai lies a broad, open valley called the Plain of Waiting, the Plain of Waiting. Bounded by peaks that rise sharply out of the South Sinai, the Plain of Waiting is where tradition says the people of Israel waited and waited in a howling desolation. They were dislocated from everything familiar. They had been reduced to a marginal existence. And as they were there waiting, they grew increasingly anxious. To their leader, they repeatedly cried, "Did you bring us out into this wilderness that we should die?" To be alive at a time of global pandemic is to occupy a plane of waiting. We are waiting for the vaccine. We are waiting for the number of active cases to reduce. We are waiting for the end of the second wave. We wait for the ending of restrictions. We wait. As he left them to climb the mountain, Moses told them to wait. And the weeks passed, and his absence stoked their anxiety. They'd come so far, they'd given up so much, they'd left everything behind. They knew they would never go back, and never would everything be the same again. They had fled, they had accepted the challenge, and in trust, they had followed their leader's directions, moving into an unknown and desolate landscape, clinging to the hope of a promised future, a new place, safer. Last April, when the virus claimed precious life after precious life and spread quickly across the globe, whole populations fled into isolation and accepted the diminishment of an uncertain and unknown landscape. New leaders emerged in the form of chief medical officers and immunologists to guide this flight into an unknown wilderness. Their directions and those of our politicians at first seemed resolute and clear. And urban areas around the world, I mean, as we saw them, I mean, around the world willingly accepted the complete shutdown of commerce and schools and social enterprise in a bid to survive the insidious contagion. This is a group of people trying to survive together as best they can. They've been in the Sinai wilderness for a day and a half now. It's midday, it's hot. And you can tell by some of them, the way they're standing, they're not even quite sure where to sit down, or perhaps even if they want to sit down. You know, they're really not sure what comes next, and maybe they want to just keep moving to get through it, right? To just carry on, because it's hard to be in that place. I mean, the woman in the foreground in the pink shirt, she's sitting on a rock. That doesn't look particularly comfortable, but you make do. And of course, that's what we're learning. We make do with this reality and what we have. In this new landscape of COVID, we've learned much. We've learned to fashion new ways of connecting. We found new ways of working and surviving together, and have adapted to this strange and fearsome landscape. It's interesting that when you read the experience of the people of Israel in the Hebrew scriptures, and that long ago experience in the Sinai wilderness, in the books that follow the account of the Exodus, it says that when the people emerged out of the wilderness at the end, they carried with them a host of new realities that they had fashioned in the wilderness experience that had not existed before. The record maintains that the desert gave them the tabernacle, the order of the priesthood, the service of the Levites, a new sort of socio-political methodology for self-governance and so on, the Torah, etc. Now, scholars caution that perhaps those may have emerged later on, or at least were not as fully formed by their wilderness sojourn. But the principal message that is heard from that long ago voice is that the wilderness had purpose, that even though their wanderings and their waiting and their hardships and the heat and the struggle was burdensome, it also became a kind of birthing room of some new realities that they carried then into their future. That is, rather than being just a stagnant or aimless period in their history, it also broke open to become a landscape of discovery, renewal, and even transformation. And we know this. Let me give you another image of valley at dusk. The plain of waiting is a harsh landscape. It's broken rock and sharp grains of granite. There's no sand on which to lay out your bedroll as you sleep in the open beneath the stars. The wind blows down the mountain passes and whistles through the camp at night, and you shiver even in the summertime. And high above, against a sparkling galaxy, the dark silhouette of Mount Sinai carves an ominous blackness as you lie there wrapped in a pervasive silence. You know, the Hebrew word for the silence of the wilderness, the silence of the desert, is damam. And the Semitic root of the word differs only by one character from the word dam, which means blood. And the correlation potentially is that what you hear in the silence of the wilderness is the sound of your own blood. It's so quiet. You hear yourself. And that seems throughout the spiritual traditions of the world, religious traditions that often speak of desert as a place of encounter. That it is in such environments of silence and stillness where we are permitted to encounter ourselves at a deeper level. And the soul is permitted to inhale and turn inwards. You know, you think of it for our experience. I mean, in March last year, the pandemic drove us into our homes, drove us inside. For many, that isolation brought a void of distressing intimacy, of distressing loneliness, but it also, for some, introduced an unfamiliar intimacy. Parents teaching their children, playing games, puzzles, doing crafts, the surge of outdoor activities that were starting to take place, couples rediscovering each other in ways of what had become an unsought, unplanned holiday. While these many months have been stressful for families, for single people, for students, for the elderly, for the employed and the unemployed, it also seems true that this interval in the year 2020 and 2021 has stirred a level of connectedness that possibly didn't exist to the same degree before. I mean, each of us would know that differently, but perhaps. This is an image from the wilderness when we would stop we'd stop always for lunch. And this was a moment where our Bedouin drivers lit a fire and put on some tea and started to bake bread. And, you know, this wonderful sort of image of, well, there's a question that happens in a place in the scriptures that says, can God spread a table in the wilderness? Yes. One of the ways that the Bedouin manage the scale of the wilderness is they periodically stop, settle in the shade of a large rock, light a small fire, and drink very strong tea. Even in 40-degree weather, I mean, you light a fire and you have hot tea. And, you know, for us, as the pace of life slows, there's a spaciousness that permits perhaps conversations to arise, connections to deepen, and the journey of life to be seen in fresh ways. For some, this period of the pandemic, life has slowed down. Certainly the economy has slowed down, but it's also accelerated other realities that we would know that if those realities were present before, they maybe were not as fully developed or appreciated as they are now. For example, someone said to me the other day, you know, the use of the internet and its application in contemporary life has pushed forward 10 years in just the last year. And we would know this, our ways of connecting through Zoom and other means, that new work patterns have emerged to a greater degree than ever existed before. Online learning to a greater degree than existed before. And we can also project, even at this point, perhaps, that there will be a reduction in business travel and long distance conferencing in the future be managed remotely rather than flying on a plane to some distant place, and that expense and expensive hotels and buffets and too many muffins and all that sort of stuff. I mean, just as much as we're seeing the alternative of work at home options arising and work clusters forming in urban areas or in rural areas, that's reducing so much stress as the reduction of stress from even the experience of commuting by car or by transit, and thereby reducing greenhouse gases in urban areas. And it seems that the captivation with the urban area, the inner city, that has been such a focus for so long, is possibly deflating as we see increased interest in real estate in rural areas, in Canmore, for example, urbanites seeking healthier lifestyle, and the rebalancing of the work-life equation. Now, many of us say, you know, we can hardly wait till things get back to where they were in terms of commerce and travel and so on. But One of the lessons of the desert is that you don't go back. The movement is always forward. And many things will be different in 2021, 2022, and beyond. 2/3 of the way up the plain of waiting is an oasis. And it's the only way the people of Israel or anyone could have survived there, even as much as the monks at St. Catherine's Monastery survive there today. This is a different location in the south central Sinai, but in the center of this image, in the upper area, is an oasis, difficult to distinguish just by the dust that's in the air, actually, which is discolored, the distinction of green. But in another image taken with a telephoto lens and a different angle, you can see more clearly the oasis of Ein Hudra in the distance. And the desolation of the wilderness, an oasis is like salvation. The flash of green seen in the distance, the heart leaps, the weary pilgrim arrives under gentle palm trees to find living water, welcome and solace from the heat of the day and shade from the blistering sun. This is another image of oasis. I love this place. It's called Ein Farah, and it's to the west of Mount Sinai. The bluish mountains in the distance are part of the massif of granite that rises up and forms the highest peak of Mount Sinai. It has igneous incursion into it, these stripes we can't see in this image, stripes of sort of a greenish gray of igneous rock that broke through at some time in geological history. But that's the distance. In the foreground, this wonderful image of life and abundance and greenery, and there's birds that sing and creatures that roam. And you realize that when the story that appears at the beginning of Genesis, that's told in the Hebrew scriptures of in the beginning there was a garden, you realize that when that story was told, it was in this context. And the listeners who heard that story thought of oasis. And just outside the garden was toil and hardship, of course, because that's what's outside the oasis. And this is the garden. One of the lessons that the Bedouins say about an oasis is that it is a gift of God for all life and cannot be claimed. It's possible that a person can dig and find water. And if they do, they can build a well, and it's given a different name. It's called Bir, as in Bir Sarir. And there you can build houses, you can claim it, you can shed blood over it, fight for it, etc. But the oasis cannot be claimed. You cannot build houses over it. It exists for all life. This oasis being Ein Farah. The question that we might ask ourselves in the midst of this COVID experience, this pandemic, is what for you has been your oasis? Or who has been for you an oasis? What have been the moments that have brought relief and shade in the blistering sun of this experience for you? The unexpected phone call, the gesture of kindness, those places and those important moments where shade has been provided. When the wilderness comes in life, it's never a destination. It always seems to be a place you pass through. We pass through it by stages, from one reality to a new reality. And it's a harsh reality that has to be survived. It's a way of wandering, a way of waiting. And at times it's a place of anxiety and longing. And yet the desert can also be a place where we are shaped for the future we are being prepared to enter. You know, and when you sit on the back of a camel and rock side to side, surrounded by stillness and silence and long views, it can be a very thoughtful time as well. And even for us as we live this journey through this pandemic, we can ask questions like, what has this, what has this time revealed about myself, about my choices? What will be different when this is over? What would I like to be different next? How is this experience changing me? I mean, yes, there have been losses, and for some, enormous losses. Um, there is much, and for some of us, we've been able to find sources of resilience. There's many questions to reflect on. The fact is, there will be a time when we do emerge from this pandemic, and we will be different and changed by it. And we will emerge and we will feel differently and deeply for those who perished in this desert, those who perished psychologically, financially, and physically. On the many journeys that I have taken into the Sinai wilderness with groups, one of the things I've learned is that there are rules for the desert. And I always share them with my groups in preparation. And I believe them also to be true for our time. And they are never go alone. That's not to say that not many of us are also living alone. We are. But never go alone is a way of saying reach out to others. Continue to keep connecting. We are social beings. We are tribal people, and support one another. Never go alone. Second rule of the wilderness is take only what you can carry, which is the voice that sounds about simplicity. Focus on the things that matter, the things from which you really derive your life. Take only what you can carry. Third rule of the wilderness is anticipate anxiety. Well, we've got that one for sure. And the fourth rule of the wilderness, quoting from the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, is if you have to wait, wait upon the Lord. Wait upon some source of spiritual strength and meaning that is larger than yourself. And you will find peace in this landscape. 4 rules of the desert. Never go alone. Keep connected. Take only what you can carry. Focus on the things that matter, from which you derive your life. Anticipate anxiety. And wait upon the holy, whatever it is that is larger and greater than yourself, as a source of meaning and peace. And I think we'll leave it there as this presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Very moving and terrific presentation. I'm just checking to see what kind of questions we've got here. First question would be, what can you tell us about the current political stability and safety for travelers in the Sinai Peninsula?
Yes. Well, you know, there's 9 tribal groups, 9 Bedouin groups in the Sinai. And to some degree they control it, but it's also part of Egypt. And so the political oversight of the administrative areas of the Sinai is governed by a military presence. And that's particularly large in the north, where a radicalized element has moved in that's related to ISIS. And that's become a huge problem, that after the end of the regime of Hosni Mubarak in 2011 in February, during the military coup in Egypt, that the military has really not been able to secure the Sinai very well. So I have not been back since then. because there have been some terrorist activities that have occurred. And yeah, I'm not going to put myself at that risk, let alone anyone else. I mean, they're infrequent, but it doesn't matter. No, I just, no thanks. So I take groups into the Wadi Rum in Jordan, and that's a wonderful experience of desert as well and wilderness. But yeah, that's to answer that question, I think.
Thank you, Richard. One other one. Can you describe more about the kind of excursion you would give to a group by taking them into the Sinai? A little bit more detail about it. It looks beautiful and challenging and tough.
Yes, it's right. If you think back to that picture of the group of people and what I was saying about them, I love the definition. I heard it years ago and I use it frequently. The definition of adventure. That adventure is hardship recalled in tranquility. So that's often what it is. It's hardship and it's risk. It's as much as us. I mean, when we go out in the backcountry here, you know, I know. I mean, we take the weather reports seriously. We prepare very carefully. We lay everything out. I lay all my gear out in the basement. I go through it very carefully, what I'm going to take into the backcountry, because you are accepting an element of risk as much as you are anticipating beauty and magnificence and stillness. But you know, the wilderness, you don't play with it, right? So I always spend a fair bit of time before we even get close to the Sinai preparing a group. Yes, with the practical things, of course, about packing and what to expect, and but also in terms of the sort of soulfulness of the wilderness to help them feel comfortable when they get there, so they can receive the gift that it gives. So my role is really to host them into that environment. And, you know, there's times when in the middle of the day, we'll find the shade of a large sort of mountain hill, and we'll give people a period of silence where they are invited to walk into the area, surrounding area, find a place and sit down for an hour in the stillness and just receive the gift of the silence and that majestic environment. And then, of course, when we arrive in camp, I'll just tell one little story about this because it's, you know, you're in Jeeps and you're bouncing around and there's always a degree of laughter and you hang on to, you know, the back of a chair and seat and we're sort of in benches facing each other and people are bouncing and there's lots of good conversation. But as you draw in at the end of the day, and the shadows are lengthening and you come in under a hill which is a kind of hollow. We had 9 campsites that we used, that we chose, which are sort of hollows in a mountain sort of area where sand had collected. And you know, you come in, the Jeeps stop and the engines are turned off, and one by one the engine's still, and when the final engine stops, you're just surrounded by this blanket of warm silence. And yeah, there's a bit of chatter, and you know, people are a bit anxious with the environment. It's new. It's so totally new, and yet the silence works on us. So the Bedouin are up on the jeeps, and they're throwing down the baggage, the knapsacks, and sleeping bags and bedrolls, and then people are invited to take a foamy and take a sleeping bag that's been provided, and their knapsack, and wander off and find a place within sight where they will lie for the night. And you know, you see people settle in, and you've invited them, you know, dig a hole for your hip and a little indentation for your shoulder, and make sure you're comfortable. And people lie down, and the Bedouin are, you know, preparing dinner, and they've got an acacia wood fire going, and they've got hot tea on. And people go back. You know, some of these people, they've never slept in a sleeping bag, let alone without a tent. And they will sleep on the Sinai wilderness looking at the stars, which are so clear. And you know, people will say, you know, I cried. I felt like I've never felt before. I mean, I was alone and yet so loved. Anyway, it's an enormous experience and a great privilege that I've been able to experience that in my life and to share that with other people. So yes, a degree of adventure, a bit of hardship, recalled in tranquility. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard. If there are no more questions, we'll wrap it up here. And if anyone has any comments or ideas or anything, they can get a hold of us at lifelonglearning@canmoreseniors.org. It's an email site, and that email is on the title slide. So if you didn't get to write it down as I spoke it there, go ahead and just look at the presentation.
Frank, could I just add a little note too, that if people want to see, if you want to see that text, most of that text was part of an article that I wrote that appeared in the UK last Monday in the Church Times. So if you Googled Church Times plane of waiting, you could just download the text from there. You could copy it. Okay. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, Richard. I hope everybody got that. And our next session is going to be on February 22nd, called New Killer Diseases by Dr. Peter Nicol. So I hope everybody can come to that one as well. And again, thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you. Lovely to be part of you. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.